What we're looking at here is a nuclear icebreaker smashing through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. This is Arctica, the most powerful non-military vessel ever built, and the flagship of Russia's ever-expanding fleet designed to traverse the frozen wastelands of the Arctic. She runs on twin nuclear reactors, has enough torque to tear through ice nearly 3 meters thick, and can stay at sea for years without coming into port. And she's not alone. Russia operates 8 nuclear-powered icebreakers. No other country has a single one. But these gargantuan vessels are more than just mere symbols of engineering might. They are the key to unlocking one of the world's most strategically important and fast-changing regions. Icebreakers like this make it possible for Russia to go where no one else can, clearing paths for oil and gas tankers, opening new trade routes across the top of the world, resupplying remote military bases, and accessing untapped natural resources. To put it simply, they're helping Russia to dominate the Arctic. For the West, that's a real problem. The Arctic is now warming nearly 4 times faster than the global average, and as the ice continues to melt, this frigid desert is transforming into a new global theatre, one that's ripe for exploitation and military expansion. That is why Donald Trump's insistence that America needs Greenland for
national security,
national security, and even international security
should not be taken lightly. We'll explore exactly what makes these icebreakers so formidable, how they underpin the Kremlin's push to conquer the polar frontier, and why the Arctic is set to emerge as a new battleground for global superpowers. Then we'll speak with one of Europe's foremost Arctic strategists to break down what this future Arctic theatre will look like and what the US and other Arctic nations must do if they hope to compete with Russia. Russia's nuclear-powered icebreakers are the backbone of its Arctic strategy, and none encapsulates this better than the Arctica. This ship and her sister vessels, designed as part of Russia's Projekt 420, or Project 22220, constitute the largest and most powerful class of icebreaker ever made. Each one measures nearly 173 meters long, 34 meters wide, and 54 meters tall. To put that in perspective, imagine a ship as long as 2 football fields and as tall as SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, all encased in a reinforced steel hull designed to withstand the most extreme conditions the Arctic can throw at it. Then there's the weight. With a displacement of more than 33,500 tons, this icebreaker is heavier than 3 of the US Navy's Arleigh Burke-class destroyers combined. Now, to move such a massive ship, you need a lot of power. To push through 3 meters of Arctic ice, you need even more. That's why, beneath this imposing exterior, this icebreaker is essentially a mobile power plant. It can produce more than 80,000 horsepower at a moment's notice to reach speeds of 22 knots or 25 miles per hour in open water. But it still has the torque required to forge a path through dense ice sheets, even at speeds as low as 5 knots. The source of this monstrous power is a pair of Rytm 200 nuclear reactors, specifically designed for marine use by one of Russia's top nuclear engineering firms, the Apitное Konstruktorskoye Bureau Mashinostроения Afrikantova. These reactors deliver 60 megawatts of power on the shafts, generating high-pressure steam to drive the ship's turbines. If you were to plug this vessel into the grid, it could power a small city, and thanks to its nuclear efficiency, it can operate for up to 7 years at sea without coming into port or refueling. Another clever design feature is the ship's dual draft capability. By adjusting its ballast tanks, a Project 22220 vessel can raise or lower itself in the water by up to 2 meters. This allows it to operate not only in deep Arctic waters, but also in shallow river estuaries and coastal ports. This means it can break ice in the open sea and then sail upriver to resupply remote Siberian settlements, energy hubs, or military outposts. Despite its size and complexity, the ship is run by a crew of just 54. These sailors enjoy compact but well-equipped living quarters, gym facilities, medical bays, and even saunas, all designed to sustain missions that can last for months in near total isolation. Russia currently commands a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered icebreakers, 4 of which are Project 22220 class. But Moscow isn't stopping there. 3 more vessels of this class are already under construction, alongside a new kind of icebreaker, Project 10510, known as the Leader class. The first Leader class vessel is scheduled for delivery by 2030 and is designed to be nearly twice as heavy as its predecessors and with double the power. These ships will be floating nuclear cities, dwarfing the already massive Arctica to combine enormous logistical capacity with both military and civilian functions on an unprecedented scale. If Russia's nuclear icebreakers are the tip of the spear, this map shows what they're aimed at. There are 8 countries with territory inside the Arctic Circle, known as the Arctic States. They are Canada, Denmark via Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. 7 of those 8 are NATO members. One of them, of course, is not. But it's Russia that is leading the race for Arctic supremacy. Really, it should come as no surprise, because Russia has always had an incentive to explore the Arctic, thanks to the simple fact of geography. The entirety of the country's northern coastline sits within the Arctic Circle. That's roughly 25,000 kilometers, or 1,500 miles, of access to the polar north. As the ice melts, that access becomes an enormous strategic advantage. The quantity of Arctic sea ice has reduced dramatically in the past 40 years, particularly during the summer, and projections suggest this trend is set to continue apace. That means that 3 main sea routes across the Arctic will become increasingly viable. The Northwest Passage, through Canada's Arctic archipelago, the Transpolar Route, straight across the North Pole, and, most importantly, the Northern Sea Route, known as the NSR. It will still be a while before the first 2 become commercially viable for several months of the year. But thanks to its icebreaking fleet, Russia's ships can already traverse the Northern Sea Route almost year-round, and they will be the first to exploit the others as they open up. The NSR cuts the journey between Western Europe and Asia by up to 40% compared to the typical route using the Suez Canal. This means less fuel, faster delivery, and more profit for the Kremlin and any company that Russia allows to use it. It also gives Russian exporters a way to sell eastwards to China, India, and others, while bypassing Western-controlled sea lanes and circumventing sanctions. Because the NSR hugs Russia's Arctic coast, it lies almost entirely within the country's exclusive economic zone, meaning Russia can patrol it, regulate it, and charge foreign vessels to use it. Beyond these shipping lanes, Russia's icebreakers are also opening access to vast mineral and energy wealth hidden beneath the ice. The Arctic region is already responsible for generating around 15% of Russia's GDP. It accounts for around 85% of the country's natural gas, 15% of its oil, 75% of its tin, and nearly 90% of its nickel, chromium, and cobalt. However, the real prize lies in what hasn't yet been touched. The US Geological Survey estimates the Arctic holds around 15% of the world's untapped oil resources and about 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. It also contains enormous reserves of the coveted rare earth elements, as well as valuable materials like titanium, iron and copper, to gold and even diamonds. To prepare for this, Russia is working hard to expand its civilian and commercial infrastructure in the high north. It's building oil and gas terminals, research stations, satellite facilities, and new ports along the NSR. But as competition for these resources intensifies, so too does the risk for conflict. Future disputes over shipping lanes and undersea claims could spark legal or even military confrontations, especially as large parts of the central Arctic remain outside any one country's economic zone and are therefore governed only by international law. So Arctic nations not only need the means to reach these zones, they also need the military capability to defend them. During the Second World War, the US occupied Greenland to safeguard the North Atlantic shipping lanes from Nazi submarines. Then, during the Cold War, both the US and the USSR realized that the fastest way to launch a nuclear strike was across the Arctic. As a result, both sides rushed to develop their military infrastructure up north. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of these sites were neglected and fell into disrepair. But since Vladimir Putin came to power, Russia has once again prioritized the militarization of the Arctic. Since 2014, Moscow has built or renovated more than 50 Arctic military and dual-use facilities, including air bases, radar sites, deep water ports, and even launch pads for hypersonic and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Among some of the most significant of these bases are Severomorsk, the headquarters of Russia's Northern Fleet and home to its nuclear submarine force; Nagorskaya, known in Russian as the Arkticheski Trilistnik, which is the northernmost military base in the world; the Plesets Cosmodrome, used for intercontinental ballistic missile tests and satellite launches; and a string of upgraded airfields across the Kola Peninsula, capable of hosting strategic long-range bomber aircraft like the Tupolev Tu-160 and the high-speed interceptor, the MiG-31. Russia's focus on the Arctic is not lost on other Arctic nations. NATO's Arctic members have ramped up joint land and air exercises and regularly host naval drills around the Norwegian island of Svalbard, and the GR-UK Gap, where Russian submarines often slip into the North Atlantic between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. All 7 of the alliance's Arctic states have announced major spending boosts in the past 3 years to enhance their civilian and military presence in the high north. And in 2024, the US Department of Defense unveiled a brand new Arctic strategy that it said would strengthen America's ability to build integrated deterrence and effectively manage risk to US interests in the Arctic. But despite these efforts, the capability gap between Russia and NATO in the Arctic remains stark. And what's more, a new player is now entering the arena. China, despite having no Arctic territory whatsoever, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and is investing heavily in polar research, infrastructure, and icebreaker development. For Beijing, gaining a foothold in the Arctic is a key part of its Belt and Road Initiative, a decades-long plan to secure China's position as a global economic and trade powerhouse. It's also an insurance policy to reduce the vulnerability of China's export-based economy to key trade choke points that are closely patrolled by the US Navy and its allies. With these ambitious powers making headway, and the West still playing catch-up, the stakes in the Arctic could hardly be higher. So, what happens next? What will the future Arctic theatre look like? And can the West do anything to regain the ground it's lost? To find out, I spoke with Nicolas Join, a senior analyst in the Defence and Security team at the RAND Europe think tank, and an expert on Arctic geopolitics.
You've got 7 Arctic countries that are part of NATO now, and you've got Russia on the other side. And obviously, if you look at a map of the Arctic itself, it's a bit like the Mediterranean Sea, except, it's another sea, but it's surrounded by those countries that seem actually much closer than we think they are on a world map. And the ramification of the Ukrainian conflict and the fact that you have got a series of, sanctions and, more and more antagonism between the West, NATO, and Russia ramifies in the Arctic. And we see those tensions potentially, increasing in this region of the world. And we're not used to see that because it's a region that, in every sense of the word, was frozen for a long time, and particularly for the US. So for the US, for a long time, no news was good news in the Arctic. They were, very happy to consider it a sort of frontier part of the world. This was NORAD security. They wanted to be sure to have the capabilities for early warning and to protect themselves against potential missile or airborne attack from the USSR and then Russia, but nothing more. And now what we are seeing is that with climate change and global warming, this region is becoming relatively more navigable, relatively more accessible, and there is more and more activities, and from Russia, among others, and also from China, that is very keen to get a foothold in the region. So obviously, if you combine those factors, it's becoming a region where the potential for conflict and frictions is becoming much higher.
So could you talk to me a little bit about the capability gap between Russia and the US and other Arctic nations in terms of its military and commercial technology and explorative abilities?
So there is definitely a capability gap to the extent that Russia has invested much more in terms of icebreakers, having like a series of like military bases and infrastructures and ports and name it, in the high north. And for them, it's critical to invest there and to be able to operate there. So we need to see that in this context as well, because it's not exactly a one-to-one. There is a bit of an asymmetry of importance. But now it is true that in terms of operating capabilities, the ability to navigate there, the monitoring capabilities, also the human capital there, Russia has much more than anyone else, definitely. The Arctic for Russia is obviously their main access to the sea, because if you take a map of Russia, you immediately understand that they don't really have many other options, and it's in particular home to the Northern Fleet and their nuclear deterrence with their ballistic missile submarines that are located there. So for them, it's also a very core element of their national defense. It's a part of the equation that is not negotiable for them. But when you see that from the other side, you see a build-up, a military build-up, and capabilities from Russia to operate in the region that you don't have yourself on the European side, on the US side. So it's easy to see that as threatening as well. Because obviously, as we said earlier, with the fact that the Arctic is becoming more and more open, and the fact that you have more and more activities there, and the perspective of more economic activities as well, more like a resource extraction, you don't want to leave Russia occupy the space alone, obviously. So this is where we are at now. It's this sort of like sense of threat of being left behind because others are investing much more than you are doing.
And that leads us on quite nicely to the US side of things. Trump has obviously made headlines around the world with his overtures to Greenland and the kind of antagonistic relationship that you're seeing now developing between the US and Denmark over Greenland. Why is it that it's taken the US so long to address the kind of this feeling of being left behind in this capability gap? Obviously, we've discussed already that Russia has a much greater historical and geographical incentive to a certain point to explore the Arctic and make sure its capabilities there are really robust. But America didn't really have a kind of clear Arctic strategy until the Obama administration, and then the DoD only really formulated a really strong Arctic policy this decade. So what's the reason for that? Why is the US lagging behind so much?
So the main element I would bring into the conversation is probably China. China is really perceived as the main threat to the American geopolitical position in the world. And obviously, we are seeing more and more activities from China in the Arctic, and also a partnership with Russia that is getting American interest for obvious reasons. So that explains what's the difference from the time where no news was good news in the Arctic for the US, because it was a region of the world where nothing much in terms of strategy, in terms of economy was expected. It's not really the case anymore. We have with potential for resource extractions in the future, and the ability to operate over there. We can see that for the US, it's not really an option anymore to not really do anything. And suddenly, all the doors start to open. So you need to be able to operate there. You need ships that are able to operate there, hull reinforced, icebreakers. You need infrastructure. You need diplomatic relations, with the different countries there and the local population. Now, obviously, the difference probably with the Trump administration and what has been happening more recently is that the Trump administration seems to have a bit more of a sphere of influence, sort of like mindset, where for them, they want to be very clear that Greenland, in particular, is part of their security complex. This is, again, something that doesn't seem very negotiable in their mind. This is part of the NORAD security architecture. And this is ultimately what is necessary for the defense of the territory, of the North American territory.
You've mentioned China a couple of times now, so let's discuss China a bit more. China is obviously nowhere near the Arctic, but it's described itself as a near-Arctic state. What are China's current Arctic capabilities, and to what extent do you think that the kind of this Russia-China cooperation that we're seeing, how deep does that run?
Yes, it's an interesting game happening there because so China and Russia are clearly claiming to have a very strong relationship and friendship even that extends to their activities in the Arctic. And this is grounded very obviously in economic interest and also like supply of gas and oil, coming from Russia and going to China. So China is a big client of Russia for this, which has been compounded by the fact that with the sanctions, when basically cutting Russia away from European and American purchase of natural gas and oil has made China even more essential. So there is a sort of incentive for both of them to play friends in this region. We speak a lot about the Northern Sea Route, and we see that most of the commercial activities over there are either intra Northern Sea Route, so actually use the Sea Route but doesn't really go out of it, or is going to China. For Russia, it works to an extent in the sense of like for them, the Arctic is still what they consider, their part of the Arctic is their territory, and they want to sort of be very clear about this. So there is nothing that we can see publicly, but we can imagine that they are both playing quite a cautious game.
Let's talk a bit more about the Arctic governance now. How would you like to see them cooperate to advance their interest in the Arctic? And do you also foresee a prospect or a possibility of them potentially kind of probing that Russia-China partnership that we discussed to test the limits of it?
On the NATO part of the Arctic, there is obviously, with the current circumstances, a lot to work on. What's interesting to see is that from a conventional military perspective, NATO has been very clear that it wanted to be able to deter any threat in this region. It considers it like its northern flank. You have like a series of exercise and interoperability exercise and cooperation over there. There is not much that NATO could do more at this very specific level. We know that in case of all-out conflict, NATO could react with what it has and pretty efficiently. So that's not really an issue at this specific level. Now, there is probably more to do at the diplomatic level. What actions from the European Arctic could be reassuring and beneficial to the alliance, and what could countries like the UK, Denmark, Norway, for instance, do extra to close the GI-UK gap potentially as well? It seems to me that it's going to depend on what position the United States is going to try to take as well, and what kind of investments, both in terms of economic perspective, in terms of diplomacy, what the US is going to try to do in order to make itself, like an essential partner for other Arctic countries, in order to not let, China occupy the space again, sort of like cooperating on, to mine and, resource extraction, obviously, and all the things. So I think this is where we are going to have to look at in the region, in terms of like how the geopolitical tensions that are taking place elsewhere in the world are ramifying there.
One thing we haven't really discussed at length yet is the environmental impact and the ecological impact of a commercial and military buildup in the Arctic. So could you talk a little bit just about what the challenges are there and what the challenges may be in the future?
So what you are saying now explains why Greenland has been taking such headlines relatively recently. It's partly because when we speak about natural resources in the Arctic, it's actually a lot about Greenland, because there is a lot that we know exist in terms of rare earth, minerals, oil and gas in this part of the world and around the island. And it's mostly untapped at the moment. And until relatively recently, we had a government that imposed strict limits on what could be explored and under what conditions. This is not really the case anymore with the new majority that has been elected a short while ago. They seem to be more keen to open this and to get mining activities back. So this is what, when we, on the short term, this is what, when we speak about natural resources in the Arctic, this is what we are talking about. Now, much more would exist, in the high sea, offshore. It's pretty hard to tap into at the moment for, technical reasons. We'll see, because I think it's going to be interesting to see what the Greenland government wants to do and how other countries of the regions are going to react for this. We can definitely see a relatively short-term future where you're going to have an increase of activities. So both in terms of extraction and in terms of trade, obviously, to get resources in and out, and trade with other nations willing to invest there. Now, it's a region, we need to be very clear with the fact that it's a region that is still extremely austere. There is a real lack of infrastructures, of search and rescue capabilities. You mentioned also the ability to get insured when you operate there. So there is a lot to do to make this viable for natural resource extraction. So speaking of the natural, environmental impact of all of this, yeah, obviously this is something that is going to be taken into account for all of this. And the Arctic Council should normally be the natural forum to deal with those kind of issues. The problem at the moment is that, collaboration with Russia is extremely hard. So when you get the countries with the biggest Arctic territory not really collaborating 100% with the rest, or not really being able, in terms of institutionally speaking, this is a bit of an issue to explore what kind of rules could be established, codes of conduct, things like this. And this is why the scientific community would be very keen to restart cooperation in those very specific kind of area and domains, because geopolitics aside, there are certain things that would be required to keep the region sustainable.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been a really insightful conversation. Just before we wrap things up, I'd just like to hand the floor to you. Is there anything that you feel we haven't discussed today that's really important that should be being discussed, or anything that journalists like myself or policymakers haven't really addressed that they should be addressing when it comes to the Arctic?
Let's just keep in mind that this is a region of the world where that is very fragile, and that is obviously starting to open, but we have local populations and indigenous populations living there, and all of this is going to have an impact on them, obviously, as we go on. And I think it's something that should be taken into account where we speak about, the increase of military activities. How could we tap into the resources, and how could we make this region, more viable for, to operate there? I think there is a point. If we want to sort of keep the tensions as low as possible, we want also to work with the people that are from there and make it work for the people that are from there. And we can see. It's interesting to see the Greenland government and population being very clear with the fact that they want to be independent, but they want to have a say in whatever is happening there, because it can be a bit lost in all the headlines and the sort of grand geopolitics that we absolutely want to make fit, in this part of the world, because of the ramifications of everything else. So yeah, that's probably something we need to keep in mind as well.
That's where this tape stops. But we'll be back soon with more episodes of Geopolitics on Tape.